Now, if you use the data pump default for parallelism, parallel equals 1, a job starts with a minimum of two processes, a control process and one worker. The control process verifies the parameters in the job description. It controls and assigns work items to the worker. However, data pump can export and import metadata and data in parallel. So you can optionally specify a degree of parallelism for the data pump job. In the example here, we're using parallel equals 4. Now that degree of parallelism of 4 is the maximum number of active parallel processes, including active workers and parallel query processes that can be concurrently executing. It does not include the control process nor the shadow process. Any workers that are not engaged are sitting idle waiting for work, and data pump will only start the number of processes that it really needs to complete the task. Now, if you're going to use parallelism, then you also need to specify multiple dump files for the parallel throughput. Now, the easiest way to do that, to specify a dump file set, is to use the %L wildcard character in the dump file name. Now, having multiple dump files avoids file locks, since a worker will lock the dump file exclusively when it writes to it. And using parallel or degree of parallelism along with the wildcard in dump file is necessary to have parallel throughput. You can also use parallelism on import. Locking isn't an issue here because the workers are only reading the dump files, and the degree of parallelism value for export and import are completely separate. For instance, if the target system has more resources available than the source, you can set a higher degree of parallelism for your import job than was actually used on the export job. By the way, you can even set or change the degree of parallelism after the job has started. Later in the webinar, we'll show you how to do that, how to change the parallelism for a running job using the interactive commands. Last topic I'd like to cover is introducing the data pump worker. What does it do and how is work assigned to it? So what does a worker process do during export? Well, the worker process may export metadata using the DBMS metadata API to collect object metadata for export. And on import, it would convert the metadata to DDL and PL/SQL for import. The worker writes the metadata it collects to a dump file, or in the case of network mode, it converts that metadata for execution. The worker process may also be processing data using the data layer to unload in the case of export, or load in the case of import, or move in the case of network mode import of the data from source to target. If you're doing a network mode import, it's going to use the DBMS_metadata API to convert the source database metadata for execution and move the data to the target. And finally, export and network mode import work in multiple phases. The export begins with one or more workers collecting metadata for export. The export can unload metadata in parallel with worker processes. For metadata export, each object path is a metadata work unit. Export collects the information as it progresses, and including finding table data items to export. It determines the number of workers for the metadata export, and it holds some of the workers in reserve if data is also being exported. Now, for data export, the table data metadata items include size estimates that drive the prioritization of the table data work item units. The table data item work units are scheduled as work processes become available. Now, if the overall export time is dominated by data export, Data Pump's going to try to initiate that data export as early in the job as possible, and with as many workers as possible. However, it may not be possible to determine a true estimate of the data export time early in the job process if large table data items are not discovered early. Export can also be dominated by metadata export, for instance, in the case of a transportable tablespace export, in that case, it's only exporting metadata.